Good morning, folks. You might think of the talk that I'm about to give as part 2 of When Worlds Collide, because I'm going to be talking a bit about a collision of two worlds as well, the world of the Anglophone internet, of which we are all a part, and the world of the Chinese internet, Chinese now ranking first among internet users in the world by population, at closing quickly on 250 million right now. So on May 19th, a week after the Sichuan earthquake rocked the province of Sichuan in China, the Beijing authorities mandated a 3-day moratorium, a 3-day period of national mourning, which included a moratorium on entertainment content on television and on the internet. As part of this, we had Chinese networks, television networks, which put an end to their sitcoms and to many of their commercials and to their sporting events. Online game sites, the very, very popular multiplayer online game sites, shut down entirely for the 3 days. Video sharing sites went to sort of news-only formats. Portals suspended all of their entertainment reporting. And virtually every internet site in China went to a black and white format, went entirely to black and white. Now, there were a few outliers. There were a few people who complained very, very loudly about this moratorium. One infamous young woman named Gao Qianhui, who was a self-professed game addict who lived in northeastern China's Liaoning province, was fool enough to actually videotape herself in a 4-minute-long diatribe in which she swore, very much like a sailor, at the victims of the Sichuan earthquake for having deprived her of her online game fix. She was promptly placed under custody, protective custody, police said, because apparently there were howling mobs out there who wanted to tear her limb from limb. In any case, she's safe and sound, although not mentally sound as far as I can tell. Most of China's digerati, though, and I would include the techie expats who live in China, among whom I would count myself, we all pretty much found this thing to be perfectly appropriate, very much in keeping with Chinese cultural norms. A 3-day moratorium, we don't get to play our games, we don't get to go out and drink in the pubs. Fine, that's perfectly appropriate. But we were surprised, and I think in some cases quite indignant, about what our counterparts in the West said in reaction to this. They tended, and I'm sure it doesn't surprise many of you here, they tended to frame the entire thing in terms of information control by an authoritarian regime. The infamous Robert Scoble, I'm sure many of you have heard of, used to be an evangelist for Microsoft, got on Twitter right away and said, "Damn, yet another example of China's government pushing around its media to serve its purposes. That's one way to get sad news off of newspapers." His sentiments were echoed on FriendFeed and other places by many of Scoble's followers, by his legions, his 20,000 plus followers. To me, though, this whole disparity in reaction over the moratorium, even though it was really a fairly small kerfuffle in one small corner of cyberspace, it was really emblematic of a massive, massive disconnect that we're now seeing between China and the West. Even as this chasm grows wider, the shouting that we're hearing across it grows only louder and ever more vociferous. As often as not, it is actually the internet itself that they're shouting about. And it's the internet itself that is doing the amplifying, which is amplifying all of this shouting. The irony here, of course, is that it's the internet of all humankind's marvels which holds such terrific potential for bringing people actually closer together, for bridging the sorts of chasms that I'm talking about. And yet, as we stand here standing nose to virtual nose, China and the West seem nowhere close to seeing eye to eye on so many of these issues. Now these days, with, like I said, nearly 250 million Chinese using the internet, remarks, for example, about the Chinese being the same goons and thugs they were 50 years ago, which CNN's Jack Cafferty infamously said, or those made 3 weeks ago, you may not have heard this, by that famous rocket scientist Sharon Stone, as she stood on the carpet at Cannes, about how the Sichuan earthquake was karmic retribution for the Chinese being not nice to her friend the Dalai Lama. These sorts of things are enraging huge numbers of people in China in mere minutes. At the same time, the all too frequent bad behavior of Beijing's regime, the vicious Fenqing, the angry youth of China who prowl the web in misguided patriotic fervor, these sorts of things are pissing off just as many people in the West in just as short of a time. So when I was invited to speak to this conference, I had no intention actually of talking about politics. In fact, I came here thinking that I was going to talk about disruptive innovation that we're seeing out of China to implode another myth entirely about the supposed lack of cultural, the lack of technological innovation coming out of China. But I thought that I really had to take advantage of this opportunity to talk about something which has been very, very much on the minds of so many of my friends, whether Western or Chinese, in China, in Beijing, where I live. Perhaps another time I'll be able to talk about the disruptive technologies and so forth, but I think really this digital divide right now, this digital divide between Chinese and the Anglophone internets, it's become now proxy, I think, for a whole complex of issues that divide China from the West. Issues that I think are going to be with us for years, for decades, as the West faces, to borrow a phrase from Fareed Zakaria, as the West faces the rise of the rest. When I say the rise of the rest, what I really mean is the rise of China, which has been sort of at the forefront of the rise of the West. Discussions about the internet wind up very much near the center of discussions about the West and China. You'll recall the upheaval in Tibet in March that welled up into disruptions over the Olympic torch relay, which then were followed by reactions by China, a popular boycott of France's Carrefour hypermarket. The earthquake in Sichuan even had a very, very heavy internet dimension to it. Before the opening ceremony of the Olympics starts on August the 8th of this year, you can bet your boots that there is just going to be another crisis and yet another crisis, more Sturm und Drang on the internet. It's no wonder to me that Westerners are baffled by all of this. I think it's no surprise at all. I mean, what kind of sense is the West to make of these hyper-nationalistic hacker types who fly into action at the slightest perceived slight to China's national dignity, to China's national honor? Why is it that they seem always to behave like beaten-up teenagers, in the memorable phrase of one friend of mine? Why are they so thin-skinned? I mean, why do they insist on taking it so personally when criticisms are directed at the government and not at the Chinese people? Why do we see this shaky confidence from a people who should be justly proud members, citizens of a fast-rising nation? When people in the West ponder these questions, there in the backdrop, censorship and state manipulation of the internet is always there lurking, even if it's only in the subtext. But it's reached a point where for many, I think, China and its infamous regime of internet controls are virtually synonymous. They're inseparable. When people think of China, it's, oh yes, it's that country that censors the internet. And it's no surprise that that's so. Especially in the minds of digerati, of all the people who are technically savvy, like those of you here in the room, for whom, and I'm sure this is true of many of you, freedom of information is absolutely sacrosanct. It's absolutely sacrosanct. The Western fixation on a free internet comes, I think, with an assumption, now explicit, now tacit, that the Chinese people that we encounter, that we engage, that we debate often very hotly online, are somehow intellectually hobbled by dint of living in an information-controlled environment. I'm sure that's true for a lot of you, the way that you encounter the comments that people make about stories, say, about Tibet.